In 1187, Saladin amassed an army of 12,000 mounted warriors and lured the Crusaders out of Jerusalem onto a plain between two hills called the Horns of Hattin. On the evening of July 3rd, after a long march, the Crusaders camped on a barren hillside.
There was nothing but a waterless terrain, and we're talking about July, we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about incredible heat and no water.
As dawn approached, Saladin's men set fire to the tall grass, and a strong wind carried the flames into the Christian encampment.
And very soon they found themselves surrounded, as in the Muslim tactic, by their enemy, and panic set in.
The flames bore down on them, and the heat became intense, Saladin's secretary wrote. The people of the Trinity were consumed by the fire of flames, the fire of thirst, and the fire of arrows.
The army of the Crusaders was totally decimated. The victory at Hattin was a real turning point for Saladin. It meant that he could then proceed to take Jerusalem later on that year.
3 months later, Saladin entered Jerusalem. For the first time in almost a century, the call to prayer floated over the holy city once again.
Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la.
And yet, remarkably, Saladin leveled no retaliation against Christians or their holy places. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Mass was celebrated as usual. Saladin also decreed that Christians who wished to could leave the city with their property. Those who chose to stay would be allowed to worship freely.
When his reputation reached Western Europe of the way he had behaved in Jerusalem over the conquest, he gradually became the most famous Muslim of all time.
Saladin's victory did not put an end to Western aspirations in the Near East. Other crusades would follow, though, as with the first, they would hardly have an impact on the larger Islamic culture. The Crusaders would eventually be driven from their citadels along the coast and return to Europe. Their only lasting legacy, a few abandoned castles. But the returning Crusaders found themselves changed by their contact with Islamic culture. The long-term impact on European life would be profound.
They were just amazed by the material culture that they found there. I mean, the quality of the merchandise, the quality of the goods was far better than anything they could find at home, and they brought it home with them.
They came back, for example, with a taste for highly spiced food. They imported pepper and cinnamon and other Oriental spices because their taste buds had been whetted by a different cuisine. We know that they found out the delights of using soap when they were in the Middle East, and it would appear that that caught on back in Europe.
After the Crusades, many Europeans were far more open to the ideas of what was going on to the east, what was happening in other parts of the world. They simply couldn't be as insular as before. Lots of people were open to, well, what's out there? Let's explore this. Let's see this. New intellectual thoughts. Let's see what these people are writing. Let's learn languages. This is when people start to learn Arabic slowly in the West.
As the barrier of language dissolved, ideas born in the great Muslim cities began to filter into Europe, ideas that would forever change Western thought. The great Italian theologian Thomas Aquinas used the writings of the Muslim philosopher Averroes to justify the clear separation of faith and reason, a Muslim ideal that formed the basis of all scientific inquiry and led to the European Renaissance. Averroes himself appears in Raphael's classic Renaissance painting of great Western thinkers. Here, alongside Plato and Aristotle, stands a vivid reminder of the debt the world owes Islam.
The scope of Islamic civilization has now reached levels which certainly were not accomplished by any other civilization, known civilization of the world. It actually unified parts of our globe in ways that had not been witnessed before.
But this golden age of Islam was not to last. After shrugging off the Crusades and bringing the precious gift of knowledge to Europe, the great cities of the Islamic Empire would be brought to ruin by a force more terrible than anything the Europeans could muster. Their libraries destroyed, the wealth plundered, the empty cities stood mute in the aftermath of a devastation that descended upon them not from the west, but from the east. It's known as the Mongol catastrophe. The Mongols were Turco-Mongolian nomads from the steppes of Central Asia. In the 13th century, they rampaged across much of Eurasia between the Ukraine and China. It wasn't long before they entered Islamic Persia.
To the cultured, urban Muslims, these guys were a bunch of savages. When you entered the Mongol army, you came with yourself and 3 horses, and you lived off the horses. First you drank their blood, and then when you moved far enough away, you killed them, you slaughtered them, and you ate their meat. And that's why they could go so far and survive so long.
Terror was the Mongols' principal tactic.
One of the local Iranian leaders foolishly decides to kill off the emissary that the Mongols have sent. And in doing that, he evokes the anger of the Mongols, who want to use him as an example. And they use this retaliatory technique often of killing off entire towns, wiping them out as examples. And so they build these fantastic towers of skulls where they pile up all the dead bodies as an example, and then all the other towns around immediately give way.
City after city fell before them. It was only a matter of time before they reached the center of Islamic power. On February the 10th, 1258, the Mongols took Baghdad. According to the Arab chroniclers, the Mongols put Baghdad to the torch and killed 10,000 inhabitants. Mosques and libraries, the collected knowledge of centuries, were all set ablaze. Within less than 50 years, the Mongols seized the heart of the Islamic Empire from the Arabs. Islamic civilization seemed poised for destruction, lost to posterity. But then something remarkable happened.
While the consensus of opinion is that Mongols were a devastating force, I personally feel that they also had a very positive effect on Western Asia and the world of Islam. They opened the world